much, everybody. Today's talk is going to be based on, in large part, on Michael Rebell's rather magisterial new law review article coming out of the Albany Law Review, Safeguarding the Right to a Sound Basic Education in Times of Fiscal Constraint. By the way, I should back up a little bit and say welcome to the Rockefeller Institute. My name is Gais. I'm director of the Institute. And thanks for going through all the scaffolding and everything else that we're going through right now. By fall, everything should be clear and beautiful by now. So thanks to SUNY Construction Fund. Anyway, at 126 pages, Michael's article is a little intimidating, but I did read it, and it's no chore at all to read. Michael's a good writer, very clear, and many of the pages are full of footnotes, which I ignored completely as we put this on. Not a lawyer. But it should be long for many reasons. His article deals with the intersection of some of the hardest and most salient issues we've been dealing with in recent years: the recession and its effects on public services and government employment, the growing economic inequality among Americans and their incomes and wealth, the critical importance of education in our economy and participation in public life, and the power and institutional capabilities of the state courts, especially in relation to our legislatures, our legislature and executive branch. It really brings out some of the very difficult issues of governance. When rights, which we usually think of sort of taking precedence over the typical legislative and budgetary processes we use, are actually require the kind of resources that are smack dab in the middle of these legislative and executive processes. And so then that's one of the things that we struggle with. Michael was last here at RIG 5 years and 7 months ago, exactly on November 20th, 2006. He spoke about the campaign for fiscal equity issue, the decision, and speculated about the forthcoming decision in his talk. Towards the end of the talk, however, I noticed something strange happening that usually doesn't happen. Sometimes we usually have a couple of people leave towards the end of these forums, usually, I guess, to avoid the State Street traffic rush, I suppose. But in this case, we were starting to pick up people towards the end, and many of them were carrying microphones, tape recorders, cameras, and other sorts of things. And then finally, when the forum was finished, there was sort of a rush up to Michael, and it turned out that the campaign CFE decision had just been handed down. They were wanting to know his opinion of it. Of course, yet he had no opinion of it because they hadn't seen it yet, so we put him back in the back room, as I recall, with a computer or some source, and he had a chance to look at the opinion and come back and have a little press conference. Well, this partly shows that here at the Rockefeller Institute, we're always on top of the latest issues. But it may also suggest that somehow, in some sort of spiritual way, Michael sort of elicits more activity among appellate court judges. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if at the end of this talk that we find out that Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, has handed out a decision in Washington. In any event, let me talk about our speakers. We're all veterans of speaking here at the Institute. Michael Rebell is Executive Director of the Campaign for Educational Equity at Teachers College at Columbia University. He's an experienced litigator in the field of education law and a professor of law and educational practice at Teachers College and Columbia Law School. He was co-counsel for the plaintiffs in the Campaign for Fiscal Equity versus State of New York case, the school funding adequacy lawsuit that claimed that the state of New York was not adequately funding public schools in New York City, not providing a basic education under the New York State Constitution. Before getting involved in the CFE litigation, Michael litigated under class action lawsuits in the area of education, including other class action lawsuits, including Jose P. versus Mills, a case involving funding for education for students with disabilities. He also served as a court-appointed special master in Allen B. Park, a special education case in Boston. John Faso is also a veteran here and a wonderful speaker here in previous forums. He's a partner in the law firm Manatt, Phelps, and Phillips, where he works in the areas of construction, healthcare, energy, and transportation, and represents nonprofit organizations coming before state government. Before serving as, after serving as committee staff member in the U.S. House of Representatives and later as a commissioner of the New York State Legislative Bill Drafting Commission, John was elected to the New York State Assembly in 1986. 12 years later, in 1998, he was selected by his caucus to serve as minority leader until he left the Assembly in 2002. At that point, he announced his candidacy for state controller, which he lost, but only by a narrow margin, and he was also a Republican candidate for the governor of New York in 2006.
Don't mention that, Mark.
Well, sacrificial lambs should get their due as well. When he served in the Assembly, John had a reputation as a proponent of fiscal responsibility and a well-deserved one, lower taxes and budget reform. He was an early and strong proponent of charter schools, and he was instrumental in the passage of charter school legislation in 1998. And he knows about putting together budgets. John was asked by Governor-elect George Pataki to chair his budget transition team in 1994. In that capacity, he supervised the staff in assembling the budget, in formulating the initial budget proposal on behalf of the newly elected governor, closing a $5 billion deficit and reducing year-to-year spending for the first time in many decades. Robert Lowry joined the New York State Council of School Superintendents in June 2002, having nearly 20 years of experience in education policy, and he currently serves as the council's deputy director. For the preceding 5.5 years, Bob worked at New York State United Teachers, most recently as manager of school finance and policy development. Before then, Bob served as a total of 5 years at the State Assembly's principal school, aide analyst, and negotiator, and worked for the Assembly Ways and Means Committee. Bob's time with the Ways and Means Committee was interrupted by 3 years of service in the governor's office, where he was assistant secretary of the governor for education and the arts during almost last 2 years in office. So we will start off with Michael, and then I'd like to have John and then Bob speak with any comments after that. Thank you very much, and we will open it up then for questions from the audience as well as questions among the participants up here to themselves. In the meantime, please power down any cell phones or any other things that are likely to make noise. And when we do have an opportunity for audience participation, please identify yourself. Thank you very much. Michael.
Hey, thanks very much, Tom. It is indeed a pleasure to be here. I remember well my last appearance, and it was an exciting time. So I hope this one will be for intellectual purposes, if not decision-enhancing purposes. In any event, let me get right to the core of what I would like to talk about, which is the budget cuts and their impact on students education. The article that Tom referred to does begin with a national scope of the impact of these budget cuts, the likely economic scenario for the coming years, and a constitutional analysis for dealing with them. But as you might suspect from the fact that it's published in the Albany Law Review, I do use New York State as my main case study. So I will dig into the footnotes just a little to give some of the details about why I think we have a very significant constitutional issue here in New York. But let me just first say, as far as the impact of these budget cuts is concerned, from a national perspective, this has been the worst economic downturn and the worst impact on social services and school funding in particular in at least 3 decades. The federal stimulus delayed the impact for several years, but now we're feeling it full blast. The Center on Budget and Policy in Washington recently did an analysis of the impact on school districts in particular of the economic cutbacks, and found that out of 46 states they managed to get information on, 30 were spending less now than they had been in 2008 before the recession began, and half of those have reduced spending by 10% or more at a time that costs have continued to rise. The likelihood, as we all know, is for continuing economic doldrums for the foreseeable future, especially with what's going on in Europe, China, other parts of the world. We're not likely to be digging out of this recession and its aftermath for years to come. So what I want to focus on is the impact of this changed economic climate on school children, and in particular on their right in New York State to the opportunity for a sound basic education that was originally announced by our Court of Appeals in 2003 and reiterated in that decision that Tom referred to in 2006. So that is very much the law of this state, and in a nutshell, my thesis is that that law is not being honored, and that despite the economic recession and its aftermath, it should be and it can be honored. The impact, let me just speak about that first before getting into my constitutional analysis. I mentioned earlier that half the states have suffered cutbacks of more than 10% in their funding level. Depending how you look at it, you could say in New York State it's roughly about 10% since 2008, but I look at it a different way. I look at it from the figure of where we should be now in 2012 in accordance with the Budget Act that the legislature passed in 2007 in response to the CFE litigation. And as you know, at that time, the Court of Appeals made clear that New York's education finance system was not meeting constitutional requirements, and the legislature took that mandate from the court, came up with a package, an extensive package for a 4-year phase-in of major reforms, including major increases in funding. And in essence, that package called for about $5 billion, something over $5 billion in increases in foundation aid. And I want to focus on the foundation aid. There also were going to be increases in other areas, but foundation aid is the core operating money. It's what pays teachers, it's what pays for instruction. It's the center of the educational enterprise. So that amount of funding was supposed to have increased by about $5 billion, a little over $5 billion, between 2007 and 2011. Instead, we got an increase of something over $2 billion in the first 2 years of the phase-in, but then we got cutbacks. We had a slight increase last year, better than a cutback, but still, from the overall long-range perspective, we're essentially back to where we were in 2007. So New York State's school children, from that point of view, are being shortchanged by about $5 billion, which is almost 30% of the foundation funding amounts. So that's the kind of cutback we're talking about in New York State. And I think it's fair to look at it that way, because we do have a situation where the highest court said that the old system was unconstitutional. The legislature said to fix that unconstitutional situation, we needed to add $5 billion to foundation funding. And in essence, none of that's been added at that time. Now, what kind of impact does this have on children's education? You know, most of the headlines, most of the news coverage of budget cuts in education in particular, tend to focus on how many teachers are being laid off, what percentage, I just said it myself, what percentage of the budget is being reduced. All of that is important, but it doesn't get to the core issue for me, which is what is the impact on kids, what's the impact on their learning in the classroom, what's the impact on this constitutional right to a sound basic education. And in the abstract, it may be that you can lay off X number of teachers, you can get greater efficiencies, and you can still provide kids the kind of education they're constitutionally entitled to. That's in theory, but it hasn't been what's happened in practice in the last couple of years. And one of the things that my project at Teachers College, the Campaign for Educational Equity, that we've been undertaking for the last year, is visiting schools and taking a very close look at what the impact has been on sound basic education, not on statistics of numbers of people laid off and all, but what difference is it making in the educational opportunities for kids. A couple of months ago, we published a preliminary analysis from our first visit to schools in New York City. We're now finishing up visits to schools in 7 districts around the state. We're looking at rural districts, suburban, small cities, as well as the large cities. And we're going to have a full report on this coming out in October, we're aiming for. In any event, based on the preliminary analysis, it's clear to us that students' opportunities for education have been severely affected, and it's starting to escalate because initially most districts were using surplus funds. They're running out of that, so it's really hitting home in the classroom. What does that mean? It means lack of access to many courses. We found in New York City, for instance, many high schools just are simply not offering chemistry and physics in their science curriculum. State regulations say you have to offer 3 years of science, so many kids now have a choice of biology, zoology, and earth science. No chemistry, no physics. How you get a college-ready, career-ready education if you want to go into any scientifically oriented field with this kind of background, I don't know. For kids with great needs, as you know, our state regulations are very clear on saying that students who are performing below proficiency levels on the various state examinations are entitled to extra services, what we call AIS services. Those are supposed to be given to all kids in all subjects that they're not proficient. What we're finding is that's being honored more in the breach than in reality. Just about every school has some AIS services, but it's a triage situation. It's not available to all kids. It's not available in all subjects. Now, how students are supposed to reach the Regents curriculum, the Regents graduation requirements, the new higher level Common Core requirements under these situations is difficult to imagine. In areas of teacher support and professional development, we're talking about greatly increased pressure on principals, on supervisors, in connection with teacher evaluations and all. What we're finding is that principals and superintendents are being spread terribly thin. They can hardly keep up with their past duties, let alone take on these new ones. Basic safety and discipline is becoming a problem again, at least in New York City schools, because of the lack of coverage and the thinness of the staff in these areas. So these are the kinds of things that are going on. I do think they raise very serious constitutional issues. So let me talk about what the constitutional perspective is here. And as you know, in CFE, the Court of Appeals said every child in New York State is entitled to the opportunity for a meaningful high school level education that prepares those students to function productively as civic participants, as citizens, and to compete in the economic marketplace. That's what a student's right is. And one thing we're doing is trying to translate into concrete terms exactly what services you do need to reach those levels to have a meaningful education, which essentially means being in a position to have a real opportunity to meet the demanding region standards. All right, that's what the children's rights are. Now, let me make clear that if there's one black letter principle of constitutional law, now there are many principles of constitutional law, as you know, that are subject to interpretation and may not be crystal clear exactly where it stands. We may find that out if indeed the healthcare decision comes down this afternoon. But one thing that is crystal clear from the U.S. Supreme Court down, just about every state court, including our Court of Appeals, and that is that constitutional rights do not get put on hold because there's a recession. Constitutional rights are not subject to undermining by fiscal circumstances or economic circumstances. That has been reiterated time and again in a whole series of cases through the federal courts, the state courts, etc. It's also been directly and specifically applied in the area of fiscal equity reform. As many of you know, in addition to the strong decision in CFE from the New York Court of Appeals, we've had similar decisions by about 24 other state courts around the country. And this principle of whether those rights can be restricted or delayed has been litigated on a number of occasions in other states. And there's been a very interesting theme running through all of the decisions that these other states have come down with, really going back to 1970. It goes back that far. There have been X number of recessions over the past 40 years, and it's led to litigations starting way back then up until just a few months ago. And the fascinating point is, I think it really illustrates my basic statement that this is black letter constitutional law. Every single court decision that has dealt with the issue of budget cuts and their impact on educational rights, every single one has said the students' rights have to be respected despite economic circumstances. Just to give you a flavor of how the courts approach this, I'm just going to read a paragraph from the decision of the Washington State Superior Court from back in the early 1970s. And they said, quote, "The duty and responsibility of the state to fully fund the common school program required by Article 9, Sections 1 and 2 is not suspended in any part during periods of fiscal crisis, even where the existing tax revenue is not sufficient to fund all of the programs that the legislature believes are necessary to meet the needs of the state. Education funding comes first," is what they were saying. It's true in New York also. Education is the only affirmative obligation of the state government in New York. So I don't want to get into a triage situation with other social services, but speaking for education, legally it has to be funded and it has to be fully funded. Since the recession in 2008, the pace of these decisions has picked up. We've had 5 major rulings from state courts over the past 3 or 4 years in New Jersey, 2 of them in California, North Carolina, Colorado. Every one of those, again, has said that the constitutional rights must be honored despite the fact that there is a recession. Some of you may remember in New Jersey about a year ago when Governor Christie substantially cut the budget, the court ordered him to restore full funding for the 31 Abbott school districts. Okay, well, if it's such smooth sailing, you may say, why are you standing here talking to a crowd in Albany rather than going back to the Court of Appeals and saying they're not honoring our constitutional rights? Let's get an immediate injunction. I want $5 billion. $5 billion. I'm going to settle for $5 billion. Well, to be candid about it, and I'm not telling anything out of school because I've written it out in my 126 pages, from an advocate's point of view, a plaintiff lawyer's point of view, there is one little problem with this history of unanimous court decisions upholding student rights despite a recession. And that is, every time a court fully focuses on the issue, they follow the law because courts are bound to follow precedents and follow law. But we've also seen in a number of these cases what I call avoidance devices. And that is judges who are sensitive to economic pressures and economic conditions finding technical ways to avoid fully facing the issue. So in New Jersey, for instance, the court was really strong in forcing Governor Christie to fully fund the 31 Abbott districts, but they found some very indirect, not completely satisfying reasons for forgetting about the other districts in the state of New Jersey who were probably suffering more from the budget cuts than the Abbott districts, which had done well over the years. And in their decision a year or two before, they had basically said there are no more Abbott districts, all districts are going to be treated the same under the new equity formula. But to have treated all the districts the same would have required them ordering the governor and the legislature to come up with $1.5 billion in taking back the cuts. What they did is found a way to limit that to $500 million for the Abbott districts and forget about the rest of them. So that's an example that where there are technical ways to honor the basic legal principle, but not do full justice for the kids. Some judges have taken that path. So that's one reason, being something of a realist, excuse me, I think from an advocacy perspective, which is a perspective I still very much take, I think those of us who are looking to safeguard these children's rights have to think hard and work hard to come up with a credible approach that the courts will buy in New York or anywhere else to deal frontally with this problem and not give us some kind of token victory, but deal with it full up and honor the children's rights. And quite frankly, in laying out the thesis that I've laid out, I would hope we can avoid going to court because, as you'll see, I'm going to briefly outline my approach. It's one that I would hope the governor and the legislature would buy into. So far, they haven't. Now, the essence of what I'm getting at is that it's simply not enough for the governor to say we're in difficult economic circumstances, we have to tighten our belts, and school districts are going to have to do more with less. It may be they have to do more with less, but the government has an obligation. The buck stops with the state under the CFE decision. It is the state's responsibility to make sure that every kid has the opportunity for sound basic education. So I think what the governor has to do and the legislature has to do is show that there are more cost-effective, more efficient ways of providing an education. You can't just say do more with less, you've got to show how they can do more with less. So that's the essence of my perspective here. The children's rights have to be honored. Maybe it won't cost $5 billion additional. Maybe it'll cost $4 billion. Maybe it'll cost $1 billion. Maybe it'll cost nothing. But we don't know because the state has not done a new cost analysis. They have not seriously looked at any way to fund cost effectiveness and cost efficiency. You know, the governor made a big hoopla about mandate relief, appointed a task force and all. We're talking about $5 billion in shortfall, and that mandate relief task force came up with a package of $125 million after a year's work, and that's statewide, and the school budget's about a third. So essentially, you got $40 or $45 million worth of mandate relief against a $5 billion shortfall. So I don't think that's been a serious effort, and I don't think the government has looked into this situation in the way that it should. That, I think, is their constitutional responsibility. Now, in the article, I put forward 5 areas where I think it is possible for us to get significant cost savings without undermining kids' rights to a sound basic education. And again, the MEDAC's approach is what I'm arguing against. You can't just say cut 10%, cut 30%, and let's see where the chips may fall. That is not constitutionally adequate. But I think if we took a more serious look at mandate relief, second area that I highlight in the paper is special education reform. As Tom mentioned, I've got a long background in bringing litigations on behalf of kids with disabilities, so I am very sensitive to upholding their rights. But I also know that's been a sacred cow, the whole area of special ed, and there are ways to save large amounts of money there without undermining the children's opportunities and rights. We can get into that in the question period. I think school district consolidation is an area where you can get some savings. They're not going to be huge, but I agree with what our Commissioner John King is trying to do in saying it's not so much the poor rural districts upstate that would make a difference. It's consolidating down in the New York City suburban areas and the Mid-Hudson that you might really be able to get some savings and some economic reform. I think the whole area of teacher retention is one that bears looking into, and that includes the evaluation process and how we're spending money in that area. And finally, I do talk about pension reform, and I think there's a lot more that can be done in pension reform. In any event, I put forward these 5 areas to start a conversation, to start a dialogue. That's certainly not the end of the matter. People may agree or disagree with the areas that I say we should be looking into, but my bottom line is, it is the governor's responsibility, it is the legislature's responsibility to look seriously into how we can save money without undermining students' rights. So I want all kids in New York City to have access to chemistry and physics. I want all kids throughout the state to get these extra time on task, to get the after-school programs they need, to get the preschool programs they need. I take seriously the commitment that New York State made and our national government made to giving all kids the opportunity to meet high, challenging state standards. And I think we may be able to do it for less than the legislature outlined in 2007, but we're certainly not on that path to accomplishing that now. So that is the essence of what I put into my 126 pages, and I'm just going to close with a statement that, as some of you may know, the governor recently set up an Education Reform Commission. I was asked to be a member of that. I've agreed to do so. So I am hoping, and I already told Dick Parsons, the chairman, that I intend to give a copy of this article to every member of the commission. As far as I'm concerned, this should be the agenda for what the commission should do on the fiscal equity and fiscal adequacy approach. Our first meeting is on Tuesday, so stay tuned for whether they're willing to do that. I hope they will, because I think this is a sound way of dealing with the problem. If the commission does not deal with it, and the legislature and the governor don't deal with it, I suspect that New York will be joining that list of states that have had litigations in this area. But litigation sometimes takes too long, and the kids can't wait, so I hope the governor's commission and the legislature will take this seriously. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out on this, what promises to be a very warm day, and I'm sure we'll be able to keep the conversation cool in here. I first wanted to thank Tom and the Rockefeller Institute for, again, inviting me back, despite probably their best instincts to do that. I also wanted to acknowledge Bob Lowry and all of his great work, and also Mike Rebell for his Sisyphean task over many years of bringing attention to the state financing of education and the needs of our kids. I also have to say a little vignette. My son is a recent graduate of the Albany Law School this year, and was a member of the Law Review. And he was home on Sunday, Father's Day, and he saw that I had this Albany Law Review article on the spread out that I had been reading, and I had been getting my way through it. And what he said to me is, "Dad, why are you reading an Albany Law Review article?" And I explained that I was appearing on this panel. So, Mike, you did at least one thing. You got me to read a law review article for the first time in many years. I think, you know, it's probably some of you know that I have long disagreed with the whole premise of the CFE litigation, although I don't disagree with the aim of the CFE litigation in this respect, that it caused the legislature, it caused the body politic, if you will, to focus on something which, as Peter Appleby and I were talking before, the state legislature, and I served there for 16 years, does a really bad job of oversight, does a terrible job of actually considering how we spend our resources today in the state, at the state and local level, and how we might better effectuate and improve and reform in that regard. I think fundamentally, however, the problem with CFE is that ultimately this is a political question. And the overall impact of the economy and what is happening both in the world and here in our state cannot be divorced from the reality of what's happening to our economy in the private sector and what's happening throughout the United States as a whole, and now as we see our relations internationally and what those impacts, be they in Greece or Spain, whatever, will have upon us. And I think the premise of the sound basic education as overriding all other considerations and policy considerations which the legislature and governor might have is one that fundamentally cannot stand on its own. And I think the problem with the CFE 1, 2, 3, as you went through the iterations, and the Judge DeGrasse and his opinion and his circumnavigation through 3 experts to try to determine what is as kind of a super legislative entity. The Court of Appeals basically in 2006 decided for the state. They said that the appropriation that Governor Pataki had brought forward, that the legislature had adopted after some fits and starts, that it met the test that they had enunciated in the prior CFE cases. And they specifically dismissed both the appellate division's argument about capital funding, and they specifically debunked the notion that Judge DeGrasse and the 3 experts could somehow divine what was the appropriate level of funding and the appropriate means to determine how money should be allocated throughout the state. Because ultimately, this is a political process, for better or worse. And regardless and one of the aspects of Mike's very, very well written and argued law review article that I was concerned about was the notion that we would somehow take cognizance of what the New Jersey Supreme Court has done through the years. This is perhaps, in my view, the worst Supreme Court in the United States of America over a very long period of time in terms of its willingness to impose their legislative and policy preferences over the political process. And it should cause, I think, all of us who believe in democracy and who believe in representative government some concern that the notion that the courts are a well-suited institution to make these divine how money should be allocated and how funding should go. Fundamentally, and I speak as with my former legislator hat on, I do not see, regardless of what the CFE, how the courts could ever require the legislature to appropriate the money to meet these standards, which may or may not have been enunciated. Ultimately, it's a political process. I think the very good thing about what CFE did is it forced the legislature and the governor, as Governor Pataki did and the legislature subsequently did, forced them to act. And that allowed the court in 2006 basically to skirt the whole issue. And they basically were able to say, hey, the governor and the legislature did this, and therefore we find that they met what we needed to do. Unfortunately then, the guy that I keep saying that it's just too bad Client 9 didn't come out a little sooner when I was running for governor in 2006. But what Governor Spitzer did was completely irresponsible. You had looming storm clouds on the horizon, and he put the pedal to the metal and made a promise which simply could not be paid. And that is why the legislature, not because they don't want to fund and throw more money at education, because literally, when I first entered the legislature in 1987, I would sit in the Republican conference and Governor Cuomo would make his annual proposal, and this would happen year in, year out. The governor would say he wanted a $100 million aid increase, and everyone would puff out their chest and say 200. He would then say he wanted a $200 million aid increase. Everyone would puff out their chest and say 400. It was completely mindless because the legislature, as I mentioned, does very little in terms of oversight and very little in terms of question is, how are we spending the money we're spending today? I think the number in New York State is over $18,000 per child. And there is, I think that a proper comparison would be to look at some achievement in other sectors, whether it's in the public charter schools, in parochial schools, in other states, in Massachusetts, which has governed itself fairly successfully under a cap for over 30 years. And I think that that's a real failing of the legislature. But we cannot divorce this discussion from the economic reality around us. The world economy is slowing. The U.S. economy is still in the dumps. We're in a very, very difficult time. We have very difficult ways and means by which we can possibly fund the entitlement promises that have been made to our public. We have an enormous federal deficit. There is no money that's going to come from Washington. We are on the verge, if you have a spike in interest rates that go from where the government is paying 1.5% for its money or nothing for its money to where they're paying 3%, it will be catastrophic to state and local and federal finance. And this is not a mere speculation. This is something that could actually happen. The very good thing in Mike's article, and I will close on this point, is that he brings forth, I think, a recognition that there has to be a look behind the curtain to try to ascertain what are we getting for the money we have and what are we doing about things like mandate relief. And as those of you who follow this process, the mandate relief process in Albany is a complete sham. There has been nothing done of substantive nature on mandate relief by either party, by any recent governor, and there is no real mandate relief. As Mike's article says, 75% of what's paid in school financing has to do with salaries and benefits. And that is to be expected, given the labor-intensive nature of the educational enterprise. However, we need to look at things, and this is a word that does not appear in the discussion in the article about mandate relief. We need to look at the granddaddy of all mandates, which is the Triborough Law, which governs labor contracts. And it is simply, you can't escape the fact that we are, despite the fact that we've had very difficult circumstances in the last 5 years, budgetary-wise in New York, and we're going to have them going forward, that we've spent literally over $1 billion in recent years just on step increases to give employees in school districts raises through step increases, when at the same time they're laying off employees and laying off teachers. The notion that you have to continue to pay step increases regardless of the economy is crazy. I served for 3 years. I was one of the original members on the Buffalo Control Board. We got into the contracts that they have in Buffalo, and it's in 2004 they were paying $2 million for elective cosmetic surgery as a benefit to the Buffalo teachers. Goes to Triborough, it just stays there. They don't have a renewed contract. In 2009 they spent $9 million on elective cosmetic surgery in one of the most impoverished, difficult school systems that you could fathom. Much worse in terms of the fundamentals in Buffalo than in New York City. So we have got to speak frankly about the underlying costs that are embedded in the close to $50 billion state and local expenditure for K through 12 education in New York State. And we've got to, in a time of economic contraction, because that is what it is, and that is what it's going to be over the next couple of years. We've got to address how are we spending our current money, and where are we going? The 5 steps that Mike, some people have a 10-step process or a 12-step process. He's proposed a 5-step process to look at how we're spending money. The last one he mentioned, pension reform. We have no pension. Tier 6 is really tier 5.1. If we really want to address this and do it in a fundamental reformist way, we have to go to strictly defined contribution systems as they are in the private sector for all new employees. And that is the only way you can give a certainty as to the future. Unfunded employee health obligations in New York State are in excess of $200 billion. Unfunded. New York City is over $50 billion. The school systems, we simply are not going to have the demographics and the economy to meet these promises going forward unless we have fundamental reform. And I hope Mike's article and some of his suggestions will move us in that direction.
Good morning. I also need to, is it on? Okay. I also need to begin by thanking the Rockefeller Institute for inviting me, and I also want to say, like John, that I'm honored to share the dais with he and Michael. They're two people, very different perspectives, as you've heard, but nonetheless, I admire both of them. Michael for his accomplishments in the Capitol and the courtroom. The 2000 reforms exceeded my expectations of what were attainable, but even more for the dedication that he exhibited over such a long period to achieve those results. John, as you heard, was the ranking member of the Assembly Ways and Means Committee during part of the time that I was the school aid analyst. And although we were on different sides, I came to admire him as a tremendously valuable public servant. He was asking the right questions. And I was proud to have him as my assembly member, even if I didn't agree with him on the issues very often. As you've heard, my career has been roughly equally divided between working on the inside of state government and on the outside, trying to influence the decisions that go on there. And I retain sympathy and enthusiasm for both types of work. Within days of starting my job for the first Governor Cuomo, I had to help explain and defend a proposal for mid-year cuts in school aid. I respect the difficult choices that state officials have to make. Frankly, superintendents and boards and voters have had to do that as well. And I give Governor Cuomo credit for putting the state's finances on a more sustainable trajectory, whatever I may think of some of the specific decisions involved in getting there. At the same time, I agree with Michael. The state has essentially abandoned the promises of the 2007 reforms without coming out and saying that it has. By freezing the foundation formula for a number of years, falling way behind in the phasing of that, and instituting a growth cap on school aid tied to growth in personal income. That's not the same thing as saying definitively that the state is now failing to meet the obligations of its constitution. Not all the 2007 reforms were strictly required by the court decision. But I'd say that in the last 2 or 3 years, something changed. We started getting questions from superintendents and other school district leaders. Can a school district declare bankruptcy? And the answer in New York State is no, you can't. There's no mechanism for that. And so what I've said to some of these local leaders, typically from poor upstate rural districts, is the fact that you're not sure how you can keep the doors open, past next year or 2 years out, to me is a pretty clear evidence that the state has failed in its duty to create a system of free common schools wherein all the children of the state may be educated. Now, that's not to say that the state has a duty to preserve all 696 or so districts as presently constituted, but I think it needs to have an answer to the question, what happens to these kids if these districts can no longer keep going? I'll get into my slides now. I'll do a couple of things. One is just illustrate how harmful just 1 year of state aid cuts can be, even if they are constructed in a way designed to be somewhat progressive. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the fundamental challenges ahead for schools. This is for the 2011 school year, the school year that is wrapping up the budget cycle that went on, budget development cycle that went on last spring. And it shows that the school aid cuts in the enacted budget were somewhat progressive. Poor districts taking cuts, about half those of the wealthier districts. Wealthiest 20%. Districts sorted based on property wealth per pupil. They proposed roughly equal tax increases. With those roughly equal tax increases, the poorest districts were able to replace about a quarter of what they lost in state aid. Put another way, they would have needed to raise taxes by about 12% to make up those losses. The wealthier districts were able to completely cover the aid losses and then some. The last column is really the key. The poorest districts, despite the relatively progressive aid cuts, despite equal tax increases, basically held their spending flat. The wealthier districts increased spending by an average of 2.2%. Key point, Michael touched on this, I think, at least in his paper, the profound impact of pension and health insurance costs on school district budgets. Our estimate last year, the year before, was that those alone would have driven up spending in school districts by 2.5%, even if they could freeze everything else. So even the wealthiest districts didn't quite cover that. The poorest districts, they had to cut a lot in order to absorb those costs and hold their spending roughly flat. You know, I'd say also that this kind of presentation is not unusual. This year, we had an aid increase. The results would look somewhat random. But 2003, another year of aid cuts. Poorest district proposed the smallest spending increases, the biggest tax increases. 2007, in contrast, first year of the foundation formula, they proposed the biggest spending increases and the smallest tax increases, kind of resulting in hopelessness. Three numbers that I think illustrate how hard it is, impossible, I think, to get from where we are to where the state wants us to be, and frankly, where I think school district leaders want. This is a chart that the state education department, for better or worse, has disseminated widely. It projects school district revenues based on the new property tax cap and state aid based on the personal income growth cap. And it projects expenditures based on historical trends. And by 2000, my first number, 28%. By 2016-17, we're projecting that there will be a structural deficit of 28% of expenditures. A couple observations. This won't happen because it can't happen. School districts can't run huge deficits year after year. It's already being closed in part by lower negotiated compensation agreements. The average superintendent's salary has been flattened statewide for the last 3 years, and we are seeing more districts getting concessions from their teacher unions and other unions. We're not going to close a 28% budget gap by focusing all our attention on squeezing the 29% devoted to the non-personnel costs. This is data from on the left for the Census Bureau 2008-9. The numbers are somewhat stable, but in any given period or any district, between 70 and 80% of their spending is devoted to personnel. So we're not going to close that whole gap just by squeezing the non-personnel costs. The other way of looking at spending is by the purpose it serves. We're not going to close that gap without touching instruction. Third number, and this is also one that is somewhat controversial, 35%. This is the percentage of students finishing high school who the state education department deems college and career ready based on their performance on Regents exams. This is controversial with school leaders. I don't completely buy it. The saying, you're college ready if you passed the math Regents with a score of 80. Most kids take the algebra Regents in 8th or 9th grade. So we're making judgments about kids' college readiness based on 8th or 9th grade. I will tell you that I was dreadful in that when I was in 8th and 9th grade, and I became the school aid analyst for the Assembly Ways and Means Committee. So somewhere along the line, I caught up. But it is, for better or worse, a measure that the state education department holds out for measuring where we want schools to go. And it's part of what was accepted in the recent federal NCLB waiver granted to New York State. The other thing I'd say is, even if I disagree with this measure, I agree wholeheartedly with the goal that a diploma should mean something. I feel this as a parent. You give my son or daughter a diploma, it should mean that he or she is ready to succeed in college or career or both. And I put another way, I'd say that I shouldn't have to pay tuition for something that is due all children as part of the state constitution's promise of free common schools. And I'd say also, as a parent of teenagers, this is no longer just a purely abstract proposition for me about not having to pay for something. So the real bottom line, again, is we're not going to close these revenue budget gaps without touching personnel. And we're not going to close those gaps and reach the expectations that the state has set for us without either more revenue or more flexibility in how we use resources for both. I'll return to the personnel issue. There are two ways to save money on personnel. Either employ fewer people or spend less per employee. It's not any more complicated than that. If we can't find some way to either get more revenue or reduce the per employee cost, we're going to have to do more layoffs, and that's really going to have a devastating impact on the opportunities we can offer to students. And so that's why my organization has come out in favor of things like tribal reform, pension reform, Tier 6, and I actually think it is more dramatic than John said, the impact of the Tier 6 legislation, and also some sort of action on health insurance. I'll conclude just by focusing on Michael's framework for constitutional compliance. And on the left-hand side, the 5 key elements. 3, 4, and 5, the primarily financial elements. I mostly agree with those. I think the number 3, that to me seems to be required by the CFP decision as a matter of law. Creating fair funding formulas, working the capital, I came to appreciate that fairness is very much in the eye of the beholder. I came to feel we have kind of a reverse Lake Wobegon effect in school finance. Somehow all the communities of the state are below average in their ability to pay for education. But certainly I can't argue with that. I would say that I thought a strength of the 2007 reforms was that they were relatively understandable. And that is a strength in terms of being able to hold state policymakers accountable for their decisions. I'll say I was somewhat horrified on first reading number 1, developing regulations to spell out what is required to deliver a sound basic education, imagining lots more mandates on schools. And I think we are already heavily regulated, but Michael does call for a review of all existing mandates. I'll focus mostly on number 2, promoting efficiency and realistic cost effectiveness measures. Again, I think that we can't reach the results that we want to reach without more revenue and also without some greater flexibility. The types of mandate relief ideas that Michael described, number 1, relatively small gauge. Undeniably helpful, but perhaps in some cases more helpful in terms of improving quality of teaching, 30/20A reform, the process for removing tenured teachers, reducing the volume of reports that districts are required to submit, freeing up leaders to spend time on more valuable undertakings, and also Wick's law reform in the construction area. We caution school leaders, don't get trapped in this tiresome game of compiling exhaustive lists of unfunded mandates. Instead, talk about what are things that the state could do that would help you reduce and control costs and maximize the impact of your resources. Special education reform. Michael criticizes some of the ideas that the education department is advocating now. We support them because I think the leadership of the department said that these are the ones that seem to be attainable right now. But agree with a lot of what Michael said. It's not just that we have the second highest percentage of kids in special ed. It's also that we serve them in much more costly and intensive or segregated ways than most other states. dubious about the ability to get significant change in special education. However, until more people understand how widely diverge from the practice in other states. And so we've suggested having some independent, respected source do a study just about how do we compare and what we require of schools in special education. Might be a job for the Rockefeller Institute to take on. School district consolidation. Superintendents in rural areas tend to be strong supporters of consolidation, at least many of them are. Because their districts are running out of kids, they say, we're not going to be able to maintain a viable high school program. We need to look at streamlining the process for consolidation, for promoting more sharing of administrative functions, and authorizing regional high schools. But this is not really going to be a big cost-saving factor. Other states have comparable numbers of school districts. Illinois and Texas, for example, they don't spend what we do. So this does not explain the whole difference. Again, we should be looking at it, but it's probably not a large part of the solution. Teacher retention, Michael's absolutely right. Single most important, school influence on student achievement. The fact is, however, we're not hiring a lot of teachers right now. And, yes, we want to improve teacher quality. I'm concerned about the impact of the new evaluation system on teacher morale and people continuing in the classroom. But I don't see this as improving teacher retention as being a way to save money over the near term. Also, I know Michael mentions in passing the seniority-based dismissal issue, so last in, first out, LIFO, doesn't really articulate a position. Fair to say that superintendents would welcome some more flexibility there. At the same time, we do hear cautions about not wanting to be pressured into a situation where you're dismissing people simply because they are well paid. Finally, on pension reform, again, we supported the Tier 6 proposal. Not perfect. I wish we could have more thoughtful discussions about what might make sense. But I don't imagine that we're going to see a lot more action on pension reform over the near term. I'll conclude by saying that I think Michael's made a valuable contribution in explaining, the implications of the CFE decision for current circumstances. I also think, as John said, that whole process was useful in focusing a lot of attention on school finance decision making. And I'd say also, I'm very pleased and grateful that Michael is on the Governor's Education Reform Commission. I think the fundamental challenge for all of us, whether it's state policymakers or school district leaders, is to be asking and answering, how do we produce the learning that our students need with the resources our taxpayers can provide? And I think that the commission is a vehicle for that, and I'm glad that Michael will be a part of those discussions.
Thank you very much, all three of you. Before I open up to any questions from the audience, would anybody like to respond to any or comment on anybody else's comments? Mike?
Thank you. I just have a couple of brief comments. Okay, and in response to John's very clear and articulate defense of the prerogatives of the legislature and the governor in this area, I don't fundamentally disagree, and I don't think the court fundamentally disagrees. And I do respect the fact that in the 2006 decision, the Court of Appeals did emphasize that on fiscal matters, it is going to defer to the governor and the legislature. It's one reason that I've gone to so much trouble to lay out what I think is a constitutional course for the governor and the legislature. And they do have a responsibility, as well as the court, for enforcing the Constitution. But on the other hand, when push comes to shove, if the other two branches don't do their job, under our system of separation of powers, it is the job of the judicial branch to make sure that the Constitution is respected. And as I said, through this commission and other means, I do hope to argue these points with the governor and the legislature and the commission this year. and see if we can make progress. But if we don't, ultimately, it will have to return to the court. And let's be clear, this governor and this legislature are violating the Constitution. Even if the governor thinks he's come up with the right amount of money with all these caps and things, the Court of Appeals clearly said in its 2003 decision that you must determine the actual cost of providing a sound basic education. Now, the legislature did that in 2007 and came up with some figures. If those figures are outmoded because of the recession or more cost-efficient methods, fine. Let's have a fair, objective study. Let's see how much money you need to keep these small rural districts from going bankrupt. Let's see what we need to do to make them more efficient. But you can't just let things drift, and you can't just put out pious statements about more with less. In response to Bob's very well-considered comments, which I appreciate, I always learn so much from Bob, I just want to focus on one aspect of where he's somewhat in common with John Faso. They were emphasizing tri-borough, and I don't say a word about tri-borough in my document. I'll tell you why. I don't think the way for us to get out of this situation is to totally beat up on teachers and the amounts of money that they're earning. You know, I'm on a national commission. I'm a commission bug these days, I guess, and the National Commission on Equity and Excellence, and we're delayed in the report that we're getting out. But I can tell you one of the things that we are really emphasizing in this national report is the critical importance of getting the most qualified people to go into teaching as a profession. The current climate has been a disaster as far as teacher retention, as far as attracting the best and the brightest, and that's the only way we're going to be able to compete internationally and all. Part of our whole problem here is that the teaching profession has not kept up with other options that college graduates have. And I know part of Governor Cuomo's strategy with the tax cut cap and the growth cap and all, we're going to put pressure to keep those salaries down. Well, I think teachers work hard, and I think the good ones need to be well compensated. I am in favor of better evaluation. I am in favor of some loosening of the seniority layoff provisions, but I'm very much in favor of teachers getting decent compensation. I also call for pension reform, and some of that is things like, in this day and age, we can't afford for people to retire with large pensions at age 55 or 57 or whatever. People in non-physical labor jobs are all working till 65 at least, and most of the teachers who retire at 55 are going out and double dipping with another job, whether it's in the private sector or wherever it is. So I do see savings there, but and I think we need to be fair to teachers and be fair to pupils. But the way to do it is not to keep squeezing salaries and say we're going to put this absolute cap. So on that point, I think we've got to be realistic about, again, the children's rights to a sound basic education, and priority number one there is a competent teacher.
Thank you very much. John or Bob, do you have any comments?
Well, the only thing that I would add is that I do think to me it's like, why did Willie Sutton, when he was asked why did he rob banks, he said that's where the money was. Yeah. If you're going to get into the mandates, and I think we have to, where the money is, it's tri-borough, and it's retiree health benefits, and it's pensions, and you know, I think it's inescapable. And the key here, it's not bashing public employees. I was one for many years, and so I don't think this is bashing public employees. It's how do you create a more viable private sector economy that creates wealth so we ease these fiscal pressures. And this is a fight, you see it played out in Indiana, in Ohio, and in Wisconsin, where there are efforts to try to bring the public sector's economy more in line with where the private sector is. Because ultimately, unless we create an environment for private sector job growth in our state, we are going to have a true vale of tears here, because these discussions, all we're doing is doing a triage in our public budgets, Medicaid versus highways and bridges versus education versus higher education. And there's not enough money to pay for all of these things. And I think that's ultimately where I see this, is that unless you have private sector economy growth, we're going to be just talking about a very diminishing pie or a very slowly growing pie in order to fund what we all want to see happen in places like K through 12.
I just say, I think with the tax cap, one of my sort of very down-to-earth reactions was it was like elected officials saying, this is, property taxes, this is a tough problem. You guys figure it out. We'll just set a limit. Well, I tried to illustrate the magnitude of the challenge before us. And either you have to give us more money or you have to change some of the rules. We cannot do all the things that they want us to do, that we need to do, that we want to do under this the framework that has been set out.
Yes.
Bill Easton of the Alliance for Quality Education. Thank you for having this forum today, and thank you for having the forum today and for the strength of the presentations. I agree with John Faso on a couple points. I see he almost choked on his water when I started by saying that. One is that we do need a viable private sector economy in the state. I think in order to do that, we need a viable method for developing a high-quality workforce. And I think we're moving rapidly in the opposite direction. I think the combination that Michael and Bob both talked about of the two caps, the state aid cap and the property tax cap, creates a finance system where every single year you're going to have what happened this year, which is you have an increase in state aid, but cuts in things like kindergarten, we can cut the half day, high school electives, advanced placement courses. So I would ask, what's the future for the workforce and the economy in New York if every single year schools are cutting the quality of curriculum and offerings that are available to students?
Well, Billy, you raise a very good point, and I wasn't choking on my water when you said you agreed with me, although I might have. I think we just have to look at the old, and I think so often we get in these discussions and we're myopic. We only focus on this one area to the exclusion of everything else. And what I'm trying to do is point out that we're facing an economic calamity in the country and here in the state, and we have to change some fundamentals. I think one salient fact that we often overlook in discussions about Medicaid, or whether it's K through 12, or whether it's roads and bridges, we overlook the fact that 1.5 million people have fled the state in the last 10 years. And many of those people are highly educated and very well educated by our public and private K through 12 systems and higher education systems in our state. And they're leaving because they can't find opportunity. Retirees are leaving because they can't pay the taxes. They're looking for some climb that is better. And I think this is the fundamental issue, which candidly, I don't think there's been much progress in really improving the private sector economy. And I think there's been a kind of a hope, an executive and legislative hope and aspiration that, if we just bide our time and manage to balance the budgets and do a few things that sound good here for a couple of years, the rising national economy will again bring us back to norm, and we can continue our trajectory in terms of spending. My message is I fear it's not going to happen because of these fundamental imbalances that we have. The federal government, regardless of who's elected, is not going to have the ability to bail out the states. And what's happening in the world economy is very troublesome. So I think that we can't be myopic. We've got to look at all of this. You're right to point out, it's a chicken and egg. One goes, it's the flip side of the same coin, a private sector economy, educated workforce. But I think right now we have to recognize the private sector economy. No one, what auto company comes to New York and establishes an auto plant here? They don't, because of the taxes, because of labor rules, etc. No one comes to New York. West of Albany and north of Saratoga is an economic basket case. It is a dead zone with some isolated instances like Cornell. But beyond that, it's dead. And people simply don't recognize it, and they refuse to recognize it.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Paul Bray. I'm an attorney. I had the pleasure of working for John when he was at the Legislative Bill Drafting Commission. And also, just to give you a sense that I had a little background in education, I taught in a rural central school district for 2 years. And it was a great job and a very tough job. Also, my father was superintendent of schools in Albany for about a dozen years in the 70s, and my mother did Title I. So at the dinner table, I heard a lot about education. An elephant in the room that I did not hear anybody say anything about is the fact that I think the schools are somewhat segregated. I write a column for the TU once a month. I rarely have a day when somebody doesn't come up to me and say, I'm moving to Del Mar, I have a kid. Or I live in the burbs because I have a child. And I can't, send them to the schools in Albany or Schenectady or Troy. Are we ever going to fix this without at least addressing that? And I was a little surprised about a week or two ago as some commentator who was also equally surprised said that candidate Romney had said something about, talking about choice, said choice ought to include the ability for an urban school kid to go to a suburban school. But you never hear that, or you very rarely hear that.
I'll take that one. I certainly agree with you. In this economic discussion, there's something very disturbing that we don't get into issues about desegregation, because in some ways you can improve education at no cost or low cost by promoting that. All the studies show that well-integrated schools are going to provide better opportunities for many low-achieving kids. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court, of course, has made it much more difficult to have voluntary school desegregation plans. But you're right, redrawing district lines or being able to move beyond district lines, or I would say with charter schools, putting more pressure on charter schools to take a firm stand on desegregation are things we should be looking into, because charters can draw from various areas, and they should be required to be much more sensitive to desegregation. I'll also mention that I think one of the reasons John King has been talking up school consolidation in the southern part of the state is that geographically it would make sense in parts of Long Island and other areas in the southern part of the state to consolidate districts, and you could have effective school desegregation, and you could save money. So I agree with you. We should be pursuing all those routes.
Yes.
Good morning. My name is Zahir Young, representing Senator Gans on this. I want to thank the Rockefeller Institute for the invitation. Something that Mr. Rebell said actually touched me pretty deeply as a recent high school graduate from New York State education system. And it's that high school should prepare students not only for a sound college education, but should also make them better civic participants. And I think if you look back at the Shep v. Board of Education case in Pennsylvania, that's an example of one student having a massive impact on the way that education is run, not just inside of his state, but its entire country. And I think that right now, looking at I'm really alarming is that there are cutbacks, so there's no music education in many schools, there's no public policy education in many schools, there's no arts education in many schools, and it really just seems as though there's no voice for a lot of these students. So we need, I feel that we need to create more feedback mechanisms so that the students who pretty much deal with these state agencies and all these baskets for money from the state can have some sort of a voice. I mean, Shep v. Board of Ed is a milestone in American education, and I was just wondering if you feel that students have a voice currently in our current education system.
Can I speak to that again? This is something we've been thinking and trying to do a lot about. I take very seriously, as you do, the fact that the Court of Appeals put in the center of its definition of sound basic education, preparation for capable citizenship. And we've got a very solid record in CFE about what that means, and to be an intelligent voter, to serve on juries and all, means relatively high-level skills, and it means interpersonal skills that you learn through extracurricular activities, student government, a lot of the things that are really being severely cut back now. So when I talk about us coming up with a proposed concrete definition of sound basic education, which is what we're going to be asking the State Ed Department, we've already started conversations with them, to put into regulations, I think we have to rethink whether music, art, whether some aspects of extracurricular, whether civic engagement through student government type activities is part of the core that has to be funded. That's part of what I mean when saying we have to rethink the regulations about what a sound basic education is. And I do think that's critical. We tend to emphasize economic competitiveness. That's important. That's part of the court's definition. But the citizenship thing is important also. And I'll just mention one other thing. We've recently been having forums with high school students in New York City. We're going to extend this throughout the state. And I've got to tell you, when you tell them that they have a constitutional right to sound basic education, which they never understood before, it galvanizes them. And I think we're going to do everything we can to get that word out among the students and have them start self-advocating. And I think if they do, we may get some more reaction out of the legislature than we've been able to so far. And I know Billy's organization is doing a lot in that regard too. So we do take that seriously.
I just say, in my remarks, I talked about district superintendents, board members asking, can we declare bankruptcy? Just saying, we will not be able to pay our debts, but there's another dimension to this that we hear, and that is people talk about so-called educational insolvency. We can't offer the things that are mandated, and some of them are. And then on top of that, the optional classes, there's stories going on in education circles about valedictorians of upstate school districts not being able to get into SUNY campuses because they haven't taken enough AP classes because their districts don't offer enough AP classes. So this is something that's emerged as a concern. One of the observations, we did a survey last summer titled At the Edge, superintendents on fiscal matters. The idea was districts are kind of at the edge of the financial cliff. And I think we'll do it again this year. And we want to ask some questions about, is your ability to deliver a sound basic education at risk? We haven't quite figured out how to get at that. But one of the things that we found was that there are districts that, in fact, were capped by circumstances before they were capped by law. They just couldn't ask their taxpayers for enough revenue to pay for the things that the community expects. And those are the places where, yes, mandate relief can help, but probably not fast enough. We do need to steer more resources to them, more state aid.
Jim, I think this will be the last one.
Thank you. Jim Fullane, economist. Read a lot about the housing and mortgage crisis, and I'm imagining myself on the other side of the Supreme Court from you, Mr. Rebell. And you said that Supreme Court's consistently said a right cannot be adjusted because of a fiscal crisis. What if evidence could be shown that the tax base and property taxes in the mid-2000s were well above what was sustainable? And we're not experiencing short-term crisis, but we're experiencing an adjustment to a more realistic equilibrium level of income. Would that affect the court decision?
Well, I think it would affect it in the same way that I'm trying to argue as a central thesis of my article, which is because of the economic circumstances, we need to do everything possible to provide the constitutionally required level of services more efficiently, more cost effectively. In fact, the Supreme Court has said that you have to honor the constitutional rights, but if you can find more economical ways ways to do that, fine. And, you know, I think all three of us have pointed out numerous areas in New York State's laws, procedures, et cetera, that are not necessary for kids to get a sound basic education and are costing a lot of money. But as I say, I don't know how much we can save on this. We haven't seriously pursued any of these areas. But for me, the bottom line is, let's do everything we can to bring the cost down. But once you've done that, you've got to do an honest cost analysis and say, whatever number of dollars we need to give the kids what's really required to make them capable citizens, to make them college ready so they can really get into these schools, that is constitutionally required. And if it will mean ultimately raising taxes, so be it. And you know, one last thing I want to say about John Faso's point that New York State's taxes are high and we're not competing with Wisconsin and these other states that are cutting their expenditures for public services. You know, I hate to think that what we're going to do is move from race to the top, as the administration's been talking about with their education competitive programs, to a race to the bottom, that we're going to start following these Midwestern governors that are cutting services to the bone. If that's the only way that we can have a viable economy, I think we've got to do a lot of soul searching from a moral point of view as well as an economic point of view.
Now, here is the disagreement. It is not cutting services to the bone. It is trying to make the dollars that taxpayers are sending stretch to a point where you can preserve vital services. It makes no sense for us to allow a situation where, like in Wisconsin, where the teachers union had effectively rigged the health insurance system, where they had to, the school districts had to buy their health insurance through something, an entity that was controlled by the teachers union. And as soon as Scott Walker was able to break that nexus, school districts were able to cut their health insurance costs by 25 to 30% in a freely competitive market. What I'm saying is that there's so many ingrained costs larded in year after year by the legislature, be they Democrat or Republican, executives, be they Democrat or Republican. We've lost sight of, we've made New York not uncompetitive. And so this isn't a function of making us like Sri Lanka or some third world country. This is a function of trying to, within the resources that we're already taking, make us more competitive. New York has among the highest income taxes, the highest or the next highest property taxes. We have high corporate taxes. We tax people on their entry into life, and we tax them on their way out of life. And many people are simply voting with their feet. And I think we are deluding ourselves if we all share this notion about improving education and music programs and the arts. It's critical to children's advancement and society's betterment. But we're deluding ourselves if we fail to look ourselves in the mirror and realize that we can't continue the spiral that New York's on in its private sector economy. Unless you create wealth in the private sector, we will not have taxes to pay for the necessary things we need. And we're now in this terrible triage where basically all these things are being sacrificed one against the other. And again, Mike's point about going through those 5 things in terms of trying to get the political process to pay attention to it, it's critical. I would just go much further on a much more accelerated basis to get more for what we're paying.
Did you have any closing comments?
We've talked a lot about money. Obviously, we're trying to produce outcomes for kids and provide learning opportunities. And I think, we've also talked about, there's another resource that perhaps is even more precious and more rigidly limited: time, students' time. And that's an area that I'm kind of introducing a new topic, but that's an area that we need to devote some attention to. Trying to provide more opportunities for students to pursue career and technical education, providing more flexibility in middle school mandates so that kids with greater needs don't have to take all the specific requirements now, allowing, reducing the reliance on seat time requirements. I think that there's a lot of stuff that needs to be on the table in order for us not just to close the budget gaps that we foresee with the new revenue gaps, but also to produce the results we want for kids.
Thank you very much. I mean, thanks all of you for raising all kinds of questions we could have for more forums, whether it be mandate relief, increasing oversight in the legislature, or dealing with the upstate economy. We get a lot of good, thoughtful, intelligent, knowledgeable people at our Rockefeller Institute forums, but these three are among the best. So thank you very much.